Hello there, students! Welcome to our virtual English class. The literature of a country is usually a product of its sociological, cultural, and historical developments. Thus, when we analyze a literary text, we distinguish not only the forms and conventions applied, but also its genre. In this lesson, you will find out the literary developments in England and the USA from the ancient times down to contemporary period, including their key features, genres, and literary writers. Also, we will have a glimpse on the literature during the ancient Anglo-Saxon period. Are you ready to learn more about Anglo-American literature? Let's get started! During ancient times before 5th century AD, stories are passed down from one generation to another through oral traditions. The epic is a genre of literature that was popular during this period. An epic is a long poem that recounts the adventures and the triumphs of a hero. Beowulf is considered one of the oldest, longest, and most important recorded epics in Anglo-Saxon or Old English. Also, poems written during this period are laden with biblical and religious themes. Kenilworth and Caedmon are the famous poets who wrote poems with religious and biblical themes. Middle Ages or Medieval Times, 5th to 15th century. The Middle Ages or medieval period lasted from the 5th to the 15th century. It began with the fall of the Western Roman Empire and the beginning of the Renaissance. During medieval times, literary works were already written in modern English and no longer in Latin. The genres during this period were heroic tales and romances that recounted the chivalry and adventures of knights. Sir Thomas Malory is one of the writers who wrote heroic tales and romances. During this period, vernacular literature also emerged. Vernacular means in the vulgar tongue, and when applied to literature, it is composed or written in the language that the author and his audience speak daily. Or in simplest form, vernacular literature is written in the language of the common people. The famous vernacular literature during this period was the Canterbury Tales written by Geoffrey Chaucer. This tale is a collection of moral and humorous stories told by a diverse group of people. Tensions run high as this group of strangers travel to Canterbury, sharing their best stories along the way. Geoffrey Chaucer was an English poet who is known as the father of English literature and is considered as the greatest English poet of the Middle Ages. Renaissance period, 1300s to 1500s. Renaissance period was a period in European history marking the transition from the Middle Ages to modernity and covering the 15th and 16th centuries. During the Renaissance era, William Shakespeare wrote lyric poems which express personal sentiments. One of his lyric poems is his collection of 154 sonnets on a variety of themes. William Shakespeare, often called England's national poet, is widely regarded as the greatest dramatist of all time, because aside from his sonnets, he wrote at least 37 plays. One of his plays is the tragic love story of Romeo and Juliet. Pastoral poems. Pastoral poems are also evident during the Renaissance period. pastoral poetry has to do with shepherding and the simplicity of life in the country, where life is free from the corruption of the city. Christopher Marlowe and Sir Walter Raleigh were two of the most famous pastoral poets during the Renaissance period. Also, literary texts are centered on religious, practical, and historical themes, just like the essays of Francis Bacon. Age of Enlightenment, Reason, or the Restoration period, 1685 to 1815. The Age of Enlightenment is also known as the Age of Reason. Literary works during the Age of Enlightenment are known for their use of philosophy, reason, wit, and refinement. Comedy of Manners. Comedy of manners was one of the popular genres during this period. Comedy of manners is a type of comedy that satirizes a specific group in society, usually the upper class. John Milton's Paradise Lost was one of the greatest fictional epic poems in the English language. It tells the story of the fall of man, in which God and Satan fight a bitter battle for the control of mankind's destiny. Also, during the Age of Enlightenment, satire was one of the literary genre that was utilized by writers to question and criticize the social norms during that time. Satire is a text that uses humor to attack a social issue. Jonathan Swift and Alexander Pope were the famous satirists during this period. John Dryden was also one of the dominant literary figures during the Age of Enlightenment. He is best known today as a satirist and was England's first poet laureate in 1668. Poet laureate means a poet given a special position by the king or queen who is asked to write poems. His famous poem is Absalom and Achitophel. This poem talks about the story of King David's favorite son Absalom and his false friend Achitophel, who persuades Absalom to rebel against his father. Romantic to Realistic period, 1770 to 1890. Writers from this period focused on the expansion of imagination that gave way to free forms of expression. One genre during this period was Gothic fiction, which features gloomy, mysterious settings, characters, and situations. This genre combines fiction and horror themes. Here are some of the famous writers who pioneered Gothic fiction. Mary Shelley. Mary Shelley was an English novelist who wrote the famous Gothic novel Frankenstein, which tells the story of Victor Frankenstein, a young scientist who creates a hideous sapient creature in an unorthodox scientific experiment. Anne Radcliffe. Anne Radcliffe was an English author who wrote the Gothic novel The Mysteries of Udolpho. The work tells the story of orphan Emily St. Aubert, who finds herself separated from the man she loves. She was threatened with the loss of her fortune and imprisoned in a haunted atmosphere of the lonely castle of Udolpho, but finally freed and united with her lover. Edgar Allan Poe. Edgar Allan Poe is best known for his poetry and short stories, particularly his tales of mystery. One of his works is entitled The Cask of Amontillado. It is the story of a man named Montresor who decided to seek revenge against a man named Fortunato who insulted him. Realistic writers during this period focused on portraying societal problems, particularly the plight of the common people. American writers during this period produced original high-quality pieces just like the works of Charles Dickens, Charlotte Bronte, and Samuel Clemens. Charles Dickens. Charles Dickens wrote the novel Oliver Twist, which tells the story of an orphan boy who doesn't know who his parents were. Charlotte Bronte. Charlotte Bronte wrote the novel Jane Eyre, a young girl who lives unhappily with her aunt and cousins. Samuel Clemens. Samuel Clemens, known by his pen name Mark Twain, wrote his most famous novel, The Adventures of Tom Sawyer, which tells the story of an imaginative and mischievous boy named Tom Sawyer who lives along the Mississippi River. Modern to contemporary period, 1900s to present. Writers during the modern to contemporary period made commentaries on the social injustice and the selfishness of the upper-class society. They also wrote literary texts based on realistic views of life. Here are some of the most influential writers during this period. Francis Scott Fitzgerald. F. Scott Fitzgerald was an American short story writer and novelist famous for his most brilliant novel, The Great Gatsby, which tells the story of Jay Gatsby's desperate quest to win back his first love for Daisy. Thomas Stearns Eliot. T.S. Eliot was a groundbreaking 20th century poet who is known widely for his poem, The Waste Land, by which T.S. Eliot tried to paint the unproductiveness and disturbance of the modern world after World War I. Robert Frost. Robert Frost was an American poet who depicted realistic New England life through language and situations familiar to common people. One of his famous works is the poem The Road Not Taken, which talks about life choices and decisions. These are some of the literary writers and the genres that gave way to the development of literature in England and the United States of America from ancient times down to contemporary period. To continue, let's have a short glimpse on the literature during the ancient Anglo-Saxon period. Literature during the ancient Anglo-Saxon period. The Anglo-Saxon period lasted from about 448 AD to 1066 AD. Most people could not read, and so most stories were told orally. Some oral stories reached different kingdoms because of traveling storytellers called scopes. Reciting poems were also common during this time. Poems were recited during ceremonial occasions such as the celebration of winning a war. During this time, poetry consisted of these categories: heroic poetry, which recounts the achievements of warriors; lyric poetry, which expressed the thoughts and feelings of the speaker; elegiac poetry, which lamented the death of loved ones. An example of elegiac poetry is the Exeter Book. Exeter Book is an Old English elegy which focused on loss, separation, and the impermanence of earthly things. Literature is important in everyday life because it connects individuals with larger truths and ideas in a society. Literature also creates a way for people to record their thoughts and experiences in a way that is accessible to others through fictionalized accounts of the experience. Literature allows us to better understand the world at large. Now that we have learned about American and Anglo-Saxon literature, here is my question for you. How do you show your appreciation for the literature of other countries? That concludes our lesson for today. Thanks for joining me. This has been Teacher Lei for ClickGen.